We've all been taught that the Russian Revolution was a spontaneous explosion of peasant rage. But what if the Red Thread was actually a British black op, financed by the Anglo-oligarchic roundtable interests nesting in the rotten blight on planet Earth called the City of London, now also operating through Wall Street? Today we're following a trail of receipts that takes us from the elite salons of London and the boardrooms of New York straight to the streets of Petrograd. Hey everyone. We're looking at the documented evidence behind the claim that the British establishment, along with some of the world's most powerful bankers, incubated the Bolsheviks to win what is often referred to as the Great Game. You can't have a revolution without an instruction manual. For the Bolsheviks, that manual was written in the British Museum with heavy Fabian involvement. At the time, every other monarchy in Europe was arresting radicals, but the British Crown instead gave Karl Marx a permanent home, and the Fabians remained strangely untouched as well, in spite of their, in elitist circles, well-known view of mass murder as a necessary part of their solution to all of society's problems. Marx wrote Das Kapital right under the nose of the world's greatest empire. But why? Founded in 1884, the Fabians, like George Bernard Shaw and the Webbs who founded the Fabian Society, wanted a scientific socialist world. Their logo, a wolf in sheep's clothing. They didn't want a violent overthrow. They wanted a managed and social engineered top-down collectivist state existing in a thick cloud of perception management, a Plato cave. The Fabians provided the intellectual operating system that would eventually be exported for use in Russia. While the Fabians handled the ideas, the Round Table handled the power. This was an elite circle led by Lord Alfred Milner, a man who believed the British Empire should be run by expert administrators, not messy democracies. The populations just couldn't know. In February 1917, just 2 weeks before the Tsar fell, Lord Milner led a British mission to Russia. Officially, it was a war planning trip. But documented accounts suggest Milner was meeting with the Tsar's rivals. Supposedly, Milner's circle viewed the Russian monarchy as an inefficient obstacle. They preferred a revolutionary government they could remote control, or at least one that would dismantle a rival empire from within. Nearly 350 revolutionaries, including Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky, met in a church in Islington, London. They ran out of money and were literally stranded. Suddenly, Joseph Fels, a wealthy soap tycoon with deep ties to British liberal and Fabian circles, stepped in with a £1,700 loan to save the Congress. Beyond London, figures like Jacob Schiff of Kuhn Loeb and Company in New York are well documented for their financial hostility towards the Tsar. Schiff funded the Japanese during the Russo-Japanese War to weaken Russia, and later supported the revolutionary cause as a response to the Tsar's anti-Semitic policies. You also have the Warburg brothers in all of this, Max in Germany and Paul, the father of the Federal Reserve, in the US. Max is famously linked to facilitating Lenin's sealed train journey from Switzerland back to Russia. Once the fire was lit, the British sent in the fixers. There's Bruce Lockhart, the official British representative in Petrograd who had a direct line to Trotsky. And there is Sidney Riley, the ace of spies. Riley was caught in the 1918 Lockhart plot, an alleged British-backed attempt to overthrow Lenin and install a more pro-Allied socialist government to get absolute control of the regime instead of just partial control. On current developments, I have to admit that the two LaRouche ladies doing the Promethean Action Channel on YouTube are kicking it way out of the park right now. I have two quite important clips for you to properly understand the hidden backstory of everything going on right now. These two ladies you may find to be a little too all-in on Trump, but this, nonetheless, is a total bullseye explaining the organic uprising in Minneapolis right now, fully paid for by roundtable oligarchs George Soros and Neville Roy Singham, the latter with base camp in China, on whose behalf he clearly appears to be operating in the US right now. Once again, reducing China to a mere smokescreen obscuring the globalist roundtable cabal behind it all, always with at least one layer of obfuscation between itself and its victims. The Demon Rat Party and conservative Republicans is just the official euphemism for the Fabianist Jacobin Party, whose methodology of societal subversion is right out of the mind of British imperialist Jeremy Bentham.
After I watched the media this week, I couldn't stop thinking about the French Revolution, because what we're watching right now is not new. It's a 200-year-old British operation, and the man who wrote the playbook has a name, Jeremy Bentham. The revolution wasn't about people rising up against a corrupt monarchy. That's the storybook version. It was a British intelligence operation run out of London, designed to prevent France from adopting the principles of the American Revolution, which had just happened. If France had adopted the American system, sovereign credit, industrial development, a productive economy serving the general welfare, Britain's imperial model of financial control and managed backwardness would have been finished. So they destroyed France from within. And the man who designed the method was Jeremy Bentham. Most Americans have never heard of this man, but understanding him will help you understand the present. Bentham wrote a direct rebuttal to our Declaration of Independence. He declared that human creativity is impossible, that knowable truth is impossible, that we are nothing but prisoners of our senses, animals responding to pleasure and pain and nothing more. Think about what he's saying. The Declaration of Independence says that human beings are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that we can know the truth, that we can create, that we can govern ourselves. Bentham looked at all of that and said, nonsense. He called for an absolute dictatorship run not by a king or parliament, but by what he called a public opinion tribunal. Bentham's public opinion tribunal had absolute authority. It ruled, obviously, through the manipulation of public opinion. Bentham laid out a precise mechanism. You control the press. You manufacture outrage on demand. You direct popular rage not at the empire pulling the strings, but at whatever target serves the empire's interests. You mobilize mobs, and anyone who resists, anyone who tries to build, to produce, to lead, is dragged before the court of public opinion and destroyed. That was the method that turned the French Revolution from a movement for human freedom into the Reign of Terror. It was funded and directed from London. Now, look at what the Democrats are doing right now and tell me it's not the same operation. And just like the French Revolution, the target isn't corruption. The target is the productive forces cooperating with a sovereign leader to rebuild this country. But here's the real difference. The French didn't know what hit them. We do. And this time, the Republic has a president who isn't playing by their rule.
This is how the Golemized masses have been insidiously perception managed into hating Trump, while being left clueless about how that actually happened to them. Bentham wasn't just a philosopher. He was the intellectual godfather of the Latin American revolutions. Why did London care about Simón Bolívar? Because every colony that broke away from Spain became a new target for business. Then another British player, Lord Palmerston, enters the picture, and he further refines the color revolution recipe.
What do a shooting in Minneapolis, the Davos smackdown, and a 170-year-old British playbook have in common? They're all part of the same war, and the empire just lost its first line of defense. President Trump's new national defense strategy just ended 80 years of American support for regime change operations abroad. No more color revolutions in other countries, no more democracy promotion. The post-war order isn't dying, it's dead. So what do the British do when they can't run their operations overseas anymore? They bring them home. Now they tell you Minneapolis is about communities fighting back against authoritarian ICE agents. But what you're really seeing is a textbook color revolution, the same tactics Lord Palmerston pioneered 170 years ago to stop the American system from spreading. And the same personnel who ran regime change in Ukraine and Syria are now running operations in the Midwest. I'm Susan Kokinda. I've studied how the British pioneered these methods going back to the 1840s. And understanding that history is going to help you see today's battle for what it really is and what it's going to take to win. So if this is your kind of fight, hit those like, share, and subscribe buttons to stay in touch and help us grow. Today, we're going to cover three things. First, Minneapolis as a classic British destabilization operation and the USAID operative caught running it. Second, why the British are suddenly obsessed with Lord Palmerston the original Color Revolution author, and third, the new National Defense Strategy as the final nail that forced them to bring the war home. While the media gaslights you about out-of-control ICE agents, Vice President J.D. Vance put his finger squarely on the truth. He said, "This level of engineered chaos is unique to Minneapolis. It is the direct consequence of far-left agitators working with local authorities." Engineered chaos, working with local authorities. Let that sink in. And here's one of those local authorities. Rachel Sayre, the EMS chief in Minneapolis, posted this attack on federal law enforcement.
My background is in international humanitarian response in conflict zones. In Yemen, Haiti, Syria, Iraq, and Ukraine. What I've seen here is what I've seen there. A powerful entity violently and intentionally terrorizing people.
Did you catch that? She just told you exactly who she is. Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Ukraine, pretty much everywhere the empire has run a color revolution, she was involved. And during the Obama administration, she worked for USAID, the very institution that Donald Trump and Marco Rubio just shut down precisely because it was a hotbed of anti-American activity, funding the NGOs that helped flood illegal immigrants into this country. She's not comparing Minneapolis to a war zone to be dramatic. She's telling you that the same class of professionals who manage regime change operations abroad are now running operations in the Midwest. And Minneapolis isn't a random flashpoint. This is ground zero, the origin of George Floyd, BLM, and American Antifa itself. The first explicitly Antifa group in America was formed in Minneapolis in 1987, explicitly modeled on a British organization and designed to import European destabilization tactics onto American soil. A foreign pathogen introduced 40 years ago, nurtured by globalist money, now fully activated. This is an organic American protest. This is a professional regime change tactic deployed on American soil. So why Minneapolis? Why now? Because the empire has just lost its primary weapon. In recent weeks, the foreign policy mouthpieces of the Anglo-American establishment have been clutching their pearls about the end of the post-war order. They know the game is up. Just look at Mark Carney, the new anti-Trump voice of the empire, delivering the obituary at Davos this week.
We know the old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy. But we believe that from the fracture, we can build something bigger, better, stronger.
But here's where it gets interesting. If you listen closely, the leading British and Commonwealth voices aren't just mourning the post-war order. They're suddenly obsessed with the 19th century. NPR is reporting that Trump's America First is dragging us back to a 19th century world of spheres of influence. And the Council on Foreign Relations warns we're drifting not by accident, but by structural necessity toward a world that looks far less like the liberal universalism of 1945 and more like the balance of power order of the late 19th century. Spheres of influence, managed rivalry, and transactional diplomacy. And then enter Jeremy Corbyn of the British Labour Party. He chimed in.
What we're looking at is almost 19th century imperial powers squabbling over bits and pieces from the rest of the world.
Now ask yourself, what was Britain's greatest fear in the 19th century? That the principles of the American Revolution would spread, that the economics of the American system would create strong, prosperous, sovereign nations, leaving the imperial policies of financial control, backwardness, and depopulation in the dust. Which, by the way, is exactly what Donald Trump is doing today. So how do they want to respond? Pay attention to the Anglosphere commentators. Suddenly, it's all the rage to quote Lord Palmerston. First, it was Lord Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Henry John Temple, Lord Palmerston, one of my great heroes, and I'm using one of my favourite books, the Dictionary of Quotations. He famously said, "We have no eternal allies, and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow." This is really important because when you're looking at foreign policy, it is crucial to remember.
Then Canadian Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre referenced Palmerston in the same way as a model for the current transition.
But we must also remember that our trade and security partnership with the U.S. is centuries old and will outlast one president. To quote the British Liberal Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, "We have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow."
And the British website Unheard lamented that the nation of Lord Palmerston is unable to secure itself a place in an emerging global order. Now, this isn't nostalgia. This is a roadmap. Lord Palmerston dominated British foreign policy from 1809 to 1865 as Secretary of War, Foreign Secretary, and Prime Minister. His mission was simple: destroy any nation or alliance that might follow in the footsteps of the United States and challenge British hegemony. And how did he do it? He didn't just use gunboats. He pioneered the use of mobs and liberation movements to destabilize rival nations from within. He sponsored anarchists, separatists, and radicals across Europe and America to break up sovereign states that threatened the empire. Lord Palmerston was the original author of the Color Revolution. And now, as the American system rises again under this administration, the heirs of Palmerston are dusting off his playbook. They see that the national security strategy and now the new national defense strategy have ended U.S. support for color revolutions abroad. So they're bringing the war home. If you're beginning to realize the world works a little different than you've been told, you need to subscribe to Promethean Action's free newsletter. We cover this fight from the standpoint of the real historical battle between empire and sovereign nations, the battle most people don't even know exists. So head on over to the Promethean Action website and subscribe. Now, what really forced the empire's hand? What made them activate the Palmerston playbook on American soil? Donald Trump and his team just spent a week at Davos delivering a very specific message. Globalism is a failure. Europe is irrelevant. We're not fighting your wars. The post-war order is dead, and the real America is back. Howard Lutnick, Scott Bessent, and Trump himself were relentless in ripping globalism to pieces. But while the media obsessed over their rhetoric, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth quietly released the 2026 National Defense Strategy on January 23rd, and that document is the real hammer blow. For 80 years, American foreign policy was written by the British. From the Cold War to NATO to the endless wars after 1989, this was all designed to keep nations locked in permanent conflict so the imperial elite could maintain control. America was the enforcer, we were their dumb giant. The new NDS throws that out the window. Here's the key paragraph. We will defend the homeland and ensure that our interests in the Western Hemisphere are protected. We will deter China in the Indo-Pacific through strength, not confrontation. We will increase burden sharing with allies and partners around the world, and we will rebuild the U.S. defense industrial base as part of the president's once-in-a-century revival of American industry. Now, this document explicitly states that the security of the U.S. homeland and the Western Hemisphere is now our primary concern, not China, where, as you saw, the language shifted from strategic competition to strength, not confrontation. And the usual saber-rattling over Taiwan, gone. Well, the British noticed. And even more shocking to the geopolitical establishment, Russia is now described as a persistent but manageable threat to NATO's eastern members. Did you catch that? A threat to NATO's eastern members, not necessarily to the United States. And the Washington Post got that message. What does this add up to? The revival of the Monroe Doctrine. The Western Hemisphere is now the foundation of American national defense. Not Europe, not the Pacific, but our neighborhood. And the Department of War isn't waiting around. Immediately after the NDS dropped, Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane announced something unprecedented. On February 11th, he's convening military leaders from 34 Western Hemisphere nations. The mission? Take down Dope Incorporated, the narco-terrorist networks that have been a favorite weapon of the British Empire since the Opium Wars. That's why Maduro was captured. That's why Venezuela, Colombia, and other countries are being given the opportunity to free themselves from the cartels. And the February meeting will bring the rest of the hemisphere into the fight. Trump didn't just ruffle feathers at Davos. He ended 80 years of British-written American foreign policy. No more permanent great power enemies. No more regime change abroad. No more color revolutions funded by USAID. No more American blood and treasure spent enforcing the empire's rules-based order. They had no choice but to activate domestic assets. The Trump administration announced the end of the post-war order, and the empire knows it. And that's why they're suddenly channeling Lord Palmerston, the original color revolution mastermind, who spent decades trying to stop the American system from spreading. They couldn't beat us through their rules-based order, so they're reaching back 170 years for the playbook that preceded it. Which brings us back to Minneapolis. This isn't spontaneous outrage over immigration enforcement. This is a Palmerston operation, professional color revolution tactics imported from Britain 40 years ago, nurtured by globalist money, and now deployed against a sitting U.S. president. The same people who ran regime change in Ukraine and Syria are running operations in Minnesota. Rachel Sayre told you so herself. But the new NDS shows we know their game, and this time we're not playing by their rules. The British establishment wants you to think America is the new empire. In fact, Chatham House is even hosting a seminar called The New Threat of Imperial America. Think about that. The headquarters of the British imperial establishment is accusing America of being imperial for refusing to fight their wars.
So Bentham basically designed the first color revolution that we know as the French Revolution, and Palmerston further refined the formula closer to how these are still done today. Now trying to instigate a Mao-Rockefeller-style cultural revolution by mass media-supported indoctrination campaigns targeting US campuses as it was done in China too back then. The Anglo-globalists are right now fighting for the very survival of the existing system, a parasitic arrangement designed to keep you suppressed. It cuts down your life and keeps you under control and dependent on the system itself under a faux moral pretense. So, Lord Palmerston, this guy was the master of puppets. In 1848, when revolutions were burning across Europe, Palmerston was the one fanning the flames. He backed radicals like Mazzini, not because he loved democracy, but because a revolution in Italy meant a headache for Britain's rival, Austria. The logic being, if you can't defeat an empire on the battlefield, like Russia or the US today, you fund people inside those empires, people who want to break it apart. You call it liberty. But the result is a weak, fractured territory bound to become pseudo-sovereign clients of banks, just to be able to stay afloat. Support for Marx and Lenin was just the next level of Palmerston's strategy of undermining and dependency instigation, as communism would sure break the Russians, both culturally and financially, to roundtable benefit. Records also show Bentham's direct involvement in the 1820s Greek loans, which tied the new nation's independence to British finance. It is well documented that the Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini operated out of London with the protection of the British government, even after other European powers demanded his arrest. Then there's the Trent affair. During the US Civil War, Palmerston's government came to the brink of war with the Union, demonstrating the British establishment's desire to see the American Republic divided and torn apart. And the current American administration is, Trump compromised by Israel or not, clearly fighting for American liberation from this oppressive Euro-socialist collectivist system based on the Fabian model. Working class liberation through socialism is an oligarchic rules by design. It's a caramelized fly strip, you could say, of rights, privileges, and benefits for humans. It was insidiously concocted by the post-Venetian Anglo-oligarchy behind the Rhodes Roundtable system to ensnare populations for human farming in a financially unsustainable parasitic system of usury profit through eventually out-of-control spiraling debts up to the offshore oligarchy itself. Yes, the financial unsustainability of the paradigm is an intended feature, not a bug. Socialism is just a sophisticated oligarchic grift. The Neo-Venetians simply established the dialectical opposition to themselves to be able to control and parasitically extract from the human herd, with its plebs experiencing just enough controlled progress to continually be willing to buy the package in the hope for more future progress. The Fabian Society and the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations were the insidious fine-tuners of this malignant piece of social engineering. Control of the system requires control of decision-makers in politics and press, but that is not the tough challenge you might think it is, especially when you have access to nearly all the money printers in the world and are willing to blackmail the rest with either real or concocted material. Or if that fails, murder, and finally, if murder fails as well, war. Even more profits. Either by direct assault or by deceptive Hegelian instigation to fool domestic populations into believing they have been attacked. To keep the herd weak against itself, the Roundtable simply partitions it into different factions of largely irrelevant differences and instigate friction between them based on relative trivialities in the larger picture to give the masses something to bicker about in a thereby contained democratic process. In the case of democratic socialism, this is expressed by political parties. This is perfectly safe for them in a system of socialized welfare, as the masters of the system know that anyone who tries to fundamentally change anything will immediately find themselves in an extreme minority position and get propelled into political irrelevancy with no chance at accessing the levels of official power in that society. This is due to the overwhelming majority of voters who transactionally depend on the continuation of the existing arrangement. This is why only ripples on the surface of the system are ever discussed, across the now largely irrelevant political divide, never the fundamentals of the construct itself. Anyone going there passes a political death sentence on themselves, as 90+% of all voters have been personally corrupted by their own personal dependencies on the current model. It keeps itself together on a glue made up of millions of voter bribery packages, being a collection of rights, privileges, and benefits. People will not consent to a fundamental change of system if they themselves stand to personally lose something from that change. So all those complaining about corruption at the top should first take a very long and hard look at themselves and consider what dependencies they might have themselves motivating them to participate in guarding the rotten status quo. Here it's also worth mentioning Alfred Eckhart Simon. Simon is widely accredited with coining the social democratic term welfare state, and was a co-founder of the first of the Rhodes Roundtable system think tanks, the one named the Royal Institute of International Affairs, also known as Chatham House, which is directly associated with the stealth socialistic think tank of highly skilled social engineers called the Fabian Society, whose official organizational shield, just to repeat it, yes, is actually a wolf in sheep's clothing. Seriously. The entire welfare state construct has been finely tuned to give the vast majority of voters just enough incentive to keep the existing arrangement going, so any attempts to change anything fundamental through democracy will face massive defeat at the ballot boxes. But, as it should be clear now, the socialist system, democratic or otherwise, is not for the voters, it's against them. The voter bribe package of rights, privileges, and benefits is just the caramelized substance on the fly strip, or perhaps the sweet luring substance inside a Venus flytrap, if that works better to illustrate. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all it is. These voter bribe packages of rights, privileges, and benefits are not because the masters of the paradigm actually care about us. They're just a part of the cost of doing business, a line in a ledger, a necessary measure to keep us out of their way and quiet and complacent, like a pacifier in the mouth of an otherwise screaming toddler. The alluring substance drawing you in is an incentivizer, in the form of a small piece of personally corrupting bribery, to get you to support the suppression of both yourself, your closest, and your neighbors, friends, and colleagues. People who can also quickly become your adversaries and snitch on you if you step out of line and threaten the system that he/she, him or herself existentially depend on. Never forget that part. The DDR is perfect real-world evidence of this, and the high-tech version will certainly not be any nicer to deal with. This reminds me of an anecdote from my own activism. In 2014, 12 years ago now, yes, I participated in an Occupy Bilderberg in Copenhagen. We were a small group of people standing a bit apart from the others when a young woman came over to us. She joined the conversation and then asked at some point, "What do we do about it?" When she learned that our solution would make her lose her own state subsidy for glasses, she turned mute and left. Not just our group, she left the entire protest. This woman was for sale for a taxpayer-funded state subsidy to her own private need for glasses. All of a sudden, she didn't care about 500,000 children killed by sanctions against Iraq as part of an illegal war based on a lie, or the return of the Islamic slave trade in North Africa after the illegal removal of Gaddafi for entirely different reasons than the official ones given. She was willing to accept all of that and more, one war crime after the other, as long as she could keep on collecting her state-subsidized glasses. That's how cheap voters are to corrupt. This is not unusual. On the contrary, it's the norm, and the original designers of this highly fine-tuned, socially engineered system of dark incentivization knew this perfectly well. They're counting on it. The saddest part is, because of her own conditioning, this young woman was not even aware of the extreme evil in her own rationale. She was basically ready to human sacrifice untold millions of people elsewhere in the world to avoid suffering any degradation of her own personal voter bribe package from the system. So there you have it. This is also why I don't see any solutions through democracy, as the number of citizens available to buy on the cheap, like that young woman, is just too large. People are for sale for pennies and will trade you in for next to nothing. If you feel like diving a bit further into this on your own, I highly recommend these two books. How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on Them by Richard Poe, and for an even deeper dive, further back into the origins of the deviousness behind it all, Nestor Webster's equally brilliant Secret Societies and Subversive Movements. You may also want to look at Rose Martin's Fabian Freeway to see how it happened in the US. So considering all of this, is it really any wonder Russia is not playing ball anymore? Who is the real major psychopath malignant of more recent world history? I think it's pretty clear. And here is what they're ultimately working at according to the Roundtable Top profile, Israel Moses Schiff.
And it tells you here, the British Fabian Society planned to take over the world by the City of London financial community was first published in a book called All These Things by a New Zealand author and journalist, A.N. Field. The book was first published in 1936 by Omni Publications in the United States, and it was censored in New Zealand. The document, called Freedom and Planning, was secretly circulated in 1932 by the inner councils of the members of the Political Economic Plan, otherwise known as PEP in London. That's a Fabian organisation. PEP, Political and Economic Plan. The then chairman of the organisation was a City of London Jew, Israel Moses Schiff, who was the reputed author of the plan. The headquarters of PEP were at 16 Queen Anne's Gate, London. Mr. Schiff was also chairman and financier of Marks and Spencer's chain stores, and he was vice president of the British Zionist Society. Centred around the City of London Jewellery's international financiers in the Bank of England subsidiary, called the Bankers Industrial Development Company, the essence of the document Freedom and Planning was, and still is, to gradually Sovietise the world based on their 5-year plan, inaugurated in Moscow in 1927-28 in the Soviet Union. Basically, the plan involved the subtle transfer of the entire productive capacity of each country throughout the world into a series of great state-owned departments, which would then be corporatised, then privatised, a City of London corporation, international banks and corporations which they control. Individual property ownership would be severely restricted, with most of the land, sea, fisheries, rivers, lakes, ports, railways, communications, media, roads, electricity, energy, food, water, waste management, housing, farms, commercial property, schools, hospitals, police, social welfare, inland revenue, etc., transferred into statutory corporations.
That sounds like the Sustainable Development Service.
It does, doesn't it?
Yes.
Companies or land trusts, which indirectly would be owned by City of London banks. The peasants They would still be allowed to own their own clothes and small assets like furniture, cars and boats.
Toys.
But the main assets of each country would be owned by their multinational corporations and banks.
Wow.
In essence, the City of London Corporation would become the One World Earth Corporation and would privately own the world. Similar to the experiment carried out in the USSR, the whole world would eventually be transferred into a communist United Nations World Soviet Socialist Republic, where each country would be regionalised and ruled through regional councils, through a United Nations dictatorship called a Parliamentary Assembly, which would just be another name for a Soviet Central Committee, and all independent, sovereign national governments would be totally abolished. So you see that ties in, Fern, with this regional government.
It does, doesn't it? Yes. Yes. 1942.
1942.
1942.
Yeah, that's right.
So, in conclusion, by all appearances, the hammer and sickle was forged on the anvil of the Round Table and deployed abroad for entirely different reasons than you probably thought. You will own nothing and be happy, and have no privacy or sovereignty, personal or national. And this is why I always call to actively resist all centralization of power as much as you can and fight all attempts at eradicating national and personal sovereignty. If successful in that mission, we will win. If not, our collective destination is a hyper-totalitarian surveillance technocracy controlled by the Milner-Fabian Roundtable, far beyond democratic reach, while populations were too successfully perception managed for too long into the process to even be cognitively capable of stopping anything while it still had the chance to do so. Thanks for tuning in. If this kind of content is of interest to you, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more insights from these deep dives into the hidden parts of history we're not supposed to know about. But that tells you exactly what you should know to be able to make much better informed decisions and take greater control over your own life. Until next time, stay safe.